See some grins out there. Yeah, we played that song. It's all right. It's all right. Hey, it is so cold out this morning. I really considered, instead of preaching on heaven, to go hellfire and brimstone today just to warm everybody up. I can only use that joke about once a year, so it's gone. I can't use it anymore. But I do want to say a special thank you right now for our greeters out front in this 5-degree weather. Pat and Jennifer Hogan making you feel welcome, shaking your hand, standing out there in that cold. I appreciate it so much. I hope you guys got a cup of coffee or something to warm up with when you came back in. Absolutely. Luke said connection is what we're all about, and places to connect out there. Last week, we celebrated with 3 different guys who took their next step in baptism and following Jesus and being obedient to him. And what a great day that was to celebrate with them. And if you have questions, I get asked all the time, my kids have questions or I've got questions. We've got a couple studies that are available out there at the Connection Place. So I would just encourage you to stop by and grab one of those and go through that study, if you will. I'm just curious, anybody here like a road trip? Anybody like a road trip? Hey, when I was a kid, I hated road trips. I hated them, I despised them, and the reason I despised them is because I've got 2 brothers. I've got an older brother and a younger brother, and not only am I the middle brother, I'm also the smallest by far. Now, my family did not have a station wagon. We did not have a minivan. So can you guess which seat belonged to me on family road trips? I had to ride in the middle over that hump in the back seat. Anybody else suffer that way? That was my seat. And I'll tell you what, there was not a lot of room. There was always fights for elbow space and leg space and trying to get all this figured out. And I despised whenever we would travel together as a family. And the only thing that made it possible, the only thing that made it endurable was if the destination where we were going was something I wanted to be at. That was the only thing that made it possible. And while I despised road trips as a kid because I thought I suffered in the middle seat, now that I'm a parent of 3, I know who truly suffered on those road trips, and it was not me. It was my mom and dad who truly suffered on those road trips. Can any parents identify with that? Sometimes in life, the destination to where we are heading is the only thing that makes the journey possible. Thus, this series we're doing right now entitled The Afterlife. What we're hoping to do in this series is we're hoping to look at the life that we are promised, the life that is to come after this life, and the hope that that life brings us. Some of you are curious, why are we doing a series on imagining heaven? Well, I don't know if you follow these things or not. I'm kind of a statistics guy, and the statistics on death are pretty overwhelming. They're pretty overwhelming. And the statistics on death have not changed through the years. They stay at 100%. Each and every one of us in this room right now at some point will face death, unless Jesus comes back before that. But all of us in this room have the same experience that all of our lives at one point or another are going to end here. And Jesus makes it very clear in his teaching, the Bible makes it very clear in its teaching, that there are only 2 destinations to which we will go once we leave this life. We're either going to spend all of eternity in heaven or all of eternity in hell. And each and every one of us are going to face this afterlife. Now, the good news is this. For followers of Jesus, we're promised that our destination for all of eternity is in heaven. We're promised that. Raymond's excited about it. I'm excited about it. I don't see much more excitement about that. And the reason why we're not so excited about our destination in heaven is simply this. Most of us in this room have probably spent more time thinking about our next vacation than we have about our eternal destination. We know where we're going to go on vacation. We know how we're going to get there. We know what we're going to do there. But when it comes to our eternal destination, we haven't spent enough time thinking about what heaven is going to be like. And the problem with that is simply this. If we can't imagine it, if we can't visualize what awaits us, we will not anticipate it, we will not desire it, and we will not live for it. Now, I know that there's a lot of questions that people have about heaven. What's heaven going to be like? What are we going to do? We surveyed you all a couple months ago about your questions and your thoughts about heaven, and we received a lot of questions that you guys had about heaven. Now, some of you want to know, is heaven going to be a real physical place? Who's going to be in heaven? Are we going to know one another in heaven? What kind of relationships are we going to enjoy in heaven? Some of you want to know if our pets are going to be in heaven. All these questions. Some of you want to know, too, what's that day of judgment going to be like? What's going to happen on the day of judgment? And really, your questions came down to three that really dominated. And the top one by far was, are we going to know each other in heaven? And how are we going to relate to one another? That was your number one question by far. Your second one was you wanted to know about the day of judgment, and then you want to know about the location of heaven. That's what you want to know. We're going to do our best in the next 3 weeks to answer those questions that you have about heaven. And the reason for that is we want to help you be able to imagine what awaits us as followers of Jesus. You know, the old saying was we would ask people who wants to go to heaven in every room, and the hand would go up, and we'd say who wants to go tonight, and no hands would go up. And the reason for that is because we haven't imagined what it's going to be like. We need to imagine heaven so we can begin to live in light of the reality that awaits us. I don't know about you, but I think this world is a world in need of hope. If you watch the news in the evening, you see that this world is growing darker and darker by the day. And it seems like this world has a way of crowding us out and stealing the hope that we have. And as followers of Jesus, we need hope. We need hope to be able to sustain us. And until just recently, heaven was the hope that sustained the followers of Jesus. Heaven was their central focus. It was what was talked about a lot. It was their life-sustaining focus. And in some places of the world, heaven is still talked about an awful lot. But it's not talked about so much here in America. Why is that? Well, it's because in other parts of the world there's great suffering for the name of Jesus. But here in America, let's just be honest, we have it pretty good, don't we? Our life is not so difficult. Yeah, it might be 5 degrees outside today, but as Butch said, we can drive in our cars to church. Our life is not, even if it is a Ford, our lives are not that difficult. And so for some of us, we have a hard time imagining that anything can be awaiting us that can be better than what we're currently experiencing here and now. And the danger for us is this. One author said it this way: Christians have become so earthly minded that we're in danger of becoming no heavenly good. And there's a lot of truth in that. We are so fixated on the here and now that we're not living for eternity. That's why Paul commands us in the book of Colossians. Check out what Paul says in Colossians 3. Since you have been raised with Christ, set your heart on things where? Above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. You know, our natural inclination is not to focus on a kingdom and a reality that we cannot see, is it? Our natural inclination is to focus on what we can see, what we can touch, what we can taste. That's our natural focus. And since it's not natural for us to focus on the unseen, Paul has to command us to tell us to focus on things above, not on things below. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about heaven, and everybody has an idea of what heaven's going to be like, what we're going to do in heaven. I was asking my kids last night what heaven's going to be like, and one of them said no more school. They wouldn't have to go to school anymore, and I said, you're awful young, and you got a lot of years of school, so you might want to lose that idea. But there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding about heaven. Everybody's got an opinion. Maria Shriver wrote a book entitled What's Heaven? And her main thesis, her main theory about what heaven's going to be like was simply this. She wrote, we're going to sit on clouds and talk all day. Fires you up, doesn't it? Fires you up. There were some celebrities that were asked about what heaven was going to be like. Eddie Falco said it's going to be like finding a parking place in front of my house. Set your sights high there, buddy. Billy Bob Thornton, all right, he said it's going to be like living on a lily pad. This guy's weird. Living on a lily pad with all the German chocolate cake and fried okra I could eat. Boy, I don't know about German chocolate. Anyway, ludicrous. He said it's going to be a life of no work, just spending money. There's no limit to the money being spent. That's a fitting name for that idea about heaven, right? Ludicrous. These things might sound good at first, but just let me ask you this. After a while, doesn't that get a little old? Sitting on a cloud, talking all day, doesn't that get a little old? Eating German chocolate cake all day, doesn't that get a little old? What do you do once you have bought everything that there is to buy? It gets a little old. I came across this Far Side cartoon that I think really sums up one of the misconceptions we have about heaven. Just leave that up there for a moment. Wish I'd brought a magazine, right? I like that there. You know, the number one misconception that we have about heaven today is we believe that heaven in some sense or form is going to be boring. That's the reality that we have. That's a misconception that we have. And the reason for that is we're afraid that heaven, just let me go ahead and say this, we're afraid somewhere along the line we have been led to believe that heaven is going to be like an all-day church service. Therefore, it has the potential, quit laughing. Therefore, it has the potential to be boring. That's why we serve sleepy time tea out there in the cafe, right? So you can just go ahead, we're helping you. A couple weeks ago, during our preschool class, the teacher was teaching about different emotions and feelings, and the idea of boredom came up. And she asked the question to 4- and 5-year-olds, have you ever been bored? Don't ever ask a question you don't want an answer to. She asked that question, and one of the boys raised his hand and said, I am right now. And that boy was my wife's son. That's all I can say. You know, we have this idea and this perception that heaven is going to be boring because it's going to be this all-day church service. We're going to be locked there for all of eternity, and there's no escape. And if I'm honest with you today, I got to admit that at one point in my life, I shared some of this misconception that heaven has the potential to be boring. I just did. I shared that perception. And it wasn't until recently that I read a book by an author by the name of John Burke. John Burke, a preacher in Texas, he wrote a book entitled Imagine Heaven. And what he did in this book was he studied over thousands of these near-death experiences, and he compared what they experienced with what the Bible actually teaches about heaven. Fascinating read, and it was a read that I could not put down. I was riveted by this book. I would encourage you, if you're interested in it, let me know, and I'll get you a copy that you can read. But what this book did for me was it fueled my imagination about what heaven has the potential to be like, and it created an excitement within me, and I can't wait to get to our eternal home of heaven. Listen, heaven is going to be anything but boring. The reason that we think heaven is going to be boring is because we think that the things that have made this life so exciting will cease to exist after this life. And where do these misconceptions that heaven is going to be boring come from? Well, we have an enemy, and his name is Satan. And Jesus tells us in the Gospel of John that Satan, among all things, is a liar. And he wants to lie to us, to distort the truth to us. And in Revelation chapter 13, we see that Satan lies mainly about three things. Look at this. It says Satan had opened its mouth to blaspheme God, to slander his name and his dwelling place, and those who live in heaven. There are three things that Satan wants to predominantly lie about. He wants to lie about who God is, the nature of God. He wants to lie about who you are and who I am as God's people. And he wants to lie about God's dwelling place, heaven. Have you ever experienced those lies of Satan? That whisper in your ear that says you as God's children are not good enough, you're not worthy enough, you can't do these things. Have you ever heard that? Have you ever heard the lie that says God really is not going to take care of you, so therefore you must worry about all these things? And one of the lies that Satan wants to tell is that God's dwelling in heaven is going to be boring. Why does Satan want you to believe that lie? Well, if he can get you to believe the lie and convince you that heaven is not worth living for, then you won't live for it. If you believe the lie that heaven is going to be boring, it's not going to excite you to live for heaven, and you're not going to try to take your friends and your family with you to heaven because you have been convinced by Satan, the father of all lies, that it's not worth living for. That's where these misconceptions come from. Listen, heaven is going to be anything but boring. And if that's the misconception we have, what does the Bible say about heaven? Well, let me give you a spoiler alert here, okay? Because in the next 3 weeks, we're going to unpack this a little bit. So I'm going to issue that spoiler alert here now and tell you what the Bible has to say about heaven. But before I do that, let me remind you, the struggle that we have with doing a series about heaven is we don't have a definitive book of the Bible that starts in the beginning and goes to the end of that book that deals exclusively with heaven. For example, if you want to know about the history of the early church, the church in Jerusalem, you pick up the book of Acts and you read through that and you'll see the history of the early church. If you want to know Paul's doctrine of salvation, then you read the book of Romans from beginning to end and you'll understand Paul's doctrine of salvation. If you want to understand joy and how you can be joyful amidst the horrible circumstances, you would go to the book of Philippians and you would read through that book and you would get that understanding. When it comes to heaven, there is not a book in the Bible that we can go to and say from beginning to end, this tells us exactly what heaven's going to be like. Instead, what we have these little snapshots, if you will, scattered throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament. We have the teachings about Jesus. We have part of John's vision and revelation. We have teachings by Paul in different places. We have teachings in Hebrews. We have all these little snapshots of what heaven's going to be like. And then you and I have to take those snapshots and we have to fill in the blanks with the imagination that God has given us to try to create a picture of what heaven might be like. And we should accept that there are certain things that we can't know about heaven. Listen, God has a lot of surprises in store for us, and I'm excited about what awaits us there, but there is a lot that we can know about what heaven's going to be like. The Bible paints a picture of heaven being like a garden, perhaps like the Garden of Eden. It shows it being a city with great walls and streets of gold and pearly gates. It shows heaven being a kingdom. It teaches us that heaven will be active participation in this new creation of God. There will be work in heaven. Don't let that depress you, because it's going to be a work that will fulfill you and bring you great joy and satisfaction like nothing here can. One of the highlights used to be for me to go sit in the barbershop uptown with Larry. And Larry had his buddy Paul Haberman, who would come and sit in there with him all the time. And I miss Paul. Paul was a special guy, and he and Larry would talk about heaven all the time. And one conversation when he asked Paul, are you going to make your bed in heaven? And Paul said, Larry, I'm not making my bed in heaven. And Larry said, well, what if Jesus tells you to? I'll make my bed in heaven then, Larry. That was his response. And I never have forgotten that conversation. Listen, there's going to be work in heaven, but it's going to be work that brings joy and satisfaction and fulfillment. The best of this resurrected world is what we will experience in new resurrected bodies. If you want a picture of what heaven might be like, picture the best of this world without the curse of sin and death. And then you can begin to picture what heaven's going to be like. Listen, there's going to be happy reunions with loved ones that have gone before us. There's going to be excitement and exploration. Is heaven going to be boring? Heaven's going to be anything but boring. And we need to have an accurate picture of what heaven's going to be like and be able to imagine that, because that's what God has told us to do. Look in Hebrews chapter 11 with me. Look at what God has to say here. The writer of Hebrews in 11, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for what? A better country, a heavenly country. And as a result of that, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Hebrews chapter 11 we commonly refer to as the Faith Hall of Fame, as there are a lot of stories about these heroes of the faith who have done exciting and great things for God in spite of the circumstances that were stacked against them. You read of the exploits there of Abraham. You read of how he followed God to a land he did not know where he was going. You can read of Samson. You can read of Gideon. You can read of Deborah. You can read of all these heroes of the faith. And the one thing that they all had in common was this. They were all laser focused, but it was not on the world that they were currently living in. They were laser focused on the world that was to come, the world that God had promised them, a heavenly dwelling. You know, Paul's command there to fix your minds on things above, not on things below, is really what is pictured here in Hebrews chapter 11. You see Paul's command in action, and you see what that command enabled them to do. There is a connection between our internal beliefs and our internal attitudes and our external behaviors. There is a huge connection between the two. And notice what the object of their faith was. It was God himself, but it was also God's city. God's dwelling, the place that God had prepared for them. And that is what enabled them to do the things that they did. Listen, we must live our lives today in light of what God has promised us and what God has prepared for us. But the issue with doing that sometimes is we say, why focus on a heavenly city when we enjoy this one so well? That might be our attitude now. But there is a day coming, and I believe it's on the doorstep right now, where the church in America is going to face persecution. It's coming, and we need to get ready for it. I came across this quote by Philip Yancey the other day that simply says this: the culture war is underway, and ironically, every year the church in the United States draws closer and closer to the situation faced by the New Testament church, an embattled minority living in a pluralistic pagan society. That's where we're headed. For years, Christians in other parts of the world had faced this open hostility from the governments, and it appears that it is now coming to America, and we don't like it. That's a reminder that every day, the church in America is coming closer to experiencing what that church in the New Testament experienced: open hostility and persecution. And some of you say it's here now. We're already experiencing that here and now. And if that's what's awaiting us, this is why it is so important that we capture a picture of what heaven is going to be like. We capture a picture of what God has prepared for us and allow that to be our faith sustainer. But not just us here and now. We've got to pass that picture on to the next generation and the generation after them, teaching them that, yes, heaven is worth it. Heaven is worth it. Heaven is worth living for. And yes, heaven is worth dying for, because what God has promised for us is so much better than what we are experiencing here and now. Hebrews 11 makes it clear that we are pilgrims. We're foreigners. We're traveling through this temporary land, looking for a better country, a country that God has prepared for us. We may be able to see it, but the reality is there that we can have confidence and faith that God has prepared it for us. And what we believe about the future, how we see the future, is going to impact the way we live in the present. How we see the future will impact the way we live in the present. You know, it was in 1952 that Florence Chadwick, who was a swimmer, she tried to swim from Catalina Island to the coast of California. She was determined to do this, and she had already swum the English Channel, but the problem was this morning she decided to swim to the California coast. The weather was chilly. It was cold. The water was cold, and as a result, it was very foggy. She could barely see the boats that were right next to her as she swam. She emerged into the water, and for 15 hours, can you imagine that? 15 hours she swam in the waters of the Pacific Ocean trying to reach the California coast. And after 15 hours, she begged to be taken out of the water. Her mom was on board the boats, and she tried to reassure her, "You're so close, keep going, you can make it, you can do it." But even after all that, she gave up, and she was pulled out. After swimming for 15 hours and giving up, she was less than a half a mile away from her destination. And this is what she had to say in a press conference: "All I could see was the fog. I think if I could have seen the shore, I could have made it. All I could see was the fog. I think if I could have seen the shore, I could have made it." Boy, this world has a way of fogging us in, doesn't it? It has a way of fogging us in and distorting our vision and beating us down. But if we can keep our eyes fixed on the shore of heaven that God has prepared for us, we're going to make it to that heavenly destination. Let me ask you this question: how would you live today if you had absolute confidence and certainty that God had prepared a place for you and was ready to welcome you home when you arrived? Would it change the way you live today in light of that promise? Is there a difference in the way you live as a follower of Jesus with the hope that you have and the way the world around us lives that doesn't have that hope? Is there a great difference? Because if there's not a difference, then that's symptomatic of the fact that we are not living for heaven, but rather we've settled for this world and its trappings. And we need to get a picture of what heaven is and open our eyes to that reality of what waits us. That's why Paul told us, fix your minds on things above, not on things below. I got some homework for you this week. Everybody likes homework, right? You guys are excited about that. Not as excited as going back to school as my kids are. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to memorize Hebrews 11:16. That simply talks about those people in Hebrews 11, how they were looking forward to a heavenly city, a city which God had prepared for them. And as a result of this faith, God was not ashamed to be called their God. I want you to commit that to memory as a reminder of where our focus should be. Because the reality is this: if I focus on heaven and not this world, I'm in a better position to be more joyful in spite of the circumstances that surround me, because I know that they're temporary. If I focus on heaven and not this world, I'm able to become more forgiving, more generous. I will live a life that is different from those around me. So that's why I want you to commit that to memory. But the second thing I want you to do, I know two-part homework, sorry, is I want you to imagine this week what heaven's going to be like. Get your head in the clouds, all right? Imagine what heaven's going to be like. How do I want you to do that? Well, I want you to look around and imagine what this world would be like if there was no sin and suffering and death. I want you to imagine, look out a window. It's too cold to take a walk, so look out a window. Look at the world. Imagine all of this without the cold. Imagine, those of you who like construction projects, imagine building something or doing a home improvement project without having to make multiple trips to Lowe's. All right? Imagine that. Imagine driving to work without your car breaking down. All right? Imagine all these things. Close your eyes. Picture the most beautiful place on the planet that you've visited or a place that you want to visit. Imagine those tearful reunions with those loved ones who have gone before you, who love Jesus and who are in his presence right now. Imagine those conversations that you will have. Imagine standing in the presence of Jesus, the one who created you and the one who gave his life to redeem you. Imagine the feeling you will have knowing that you are fully known in his presence and still fully loved and accepted. Can you picture it? Can you imagine what that's going to be like? Boy, when you can get a picture of that, you will understand that heaven is worth living for. Because the way you see the future will impact the way you live in the present. Boy, I hope you'll come back in the next couple of weeks as we continue to unpack. I'm excited about this series as we unpack and answer those questions about what awaits us when we leave this life and experience the life that's to come. Will you pray with me this morning? Lord Jesus, I thank you for the promises you've given us in your word. Lord, I thank you that you're preparing a place for us that no eye has seen or no ear has heard or no mind can even fathom and comprehend what you have ready for us. But you've given us pictures throughout your word that allow us to get a vision, a picture of what it is that awaits us, Lord. And I pray that that excites us. I know it excites me. But I pray that it excites all of us. And that all of us will have that vision of what it is that's awaiting us, and we'll determine that that's worth living for. Lord Jesus, I thank you for preparing a way for us to get back with you. It's in your name we pray.